Yo, what's up, everybody? Thank you for joining me again tonight. We're going to be covering another work of classic prose. We're going to be doing tonight. We're going to be doing an American novel, The Great Gatsby, by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I will get to my personal feelings about this novel as we go along, and they certainly have changed. My feelings about this novel have changed over the years and they may have changed back a little bit. I reread the novel again today, and I'm sure everybody who's watching this has read this novel. It's classic work of American literature, and everybody's read this in high school. You probably did this for summer reading. You may have read it in college, grad school. You may have read it a couple times. I've read it for as much as I frankly came to dislike this novel. I've read it way too many times, which is weird. But I reread it again today, and I don't know what drew me again to reread this, but I kept thinking about how it ties in the the title character Gatsby ties in with certain characters that we know from the let's just say certain intelligence ties. And what did Jerry say at the beginning? Jepstein Effrey didn't spelunk himself. Listen, folks, Jepstein Effrey didn't spelunk himself at Hearst Castle, okay? We've got the documents. I'm not bragging, but I happen to have certain Jade Helm documents that were delivered to me by certain people, Colonel Anthony Schaefer, and I'm not going to name anybody else, but we've got the documents, folks. So, yes. So we're going to be going into this book, and again, as we've seen with a lot of the work that we've read, it may not be how you remember it, or you may glean new information from this. And I can't help but think of Jepstein Effrey as a Great Gatsby-esque character. And I went back and looked, it's some of the MSM just to refresh myself on this, and type it into a search engine, and you will get many, many articles comparing Jepstein Effrey to Gatsby. He's a quasi Gatsby figure. He's a Gatsby-esque figure. He threw Gatsby parties. So as is sort of our modus operandi here at Bayes Lit Analyzer, please like and share the stream. Obligatory, right? Please hit like. Make sure you leave a comment after this is over. And I'll get to in a second how to support me. And thank you to everybody who supported me. I'm going to give some special shout outs in a few minutes. But yeah, we're going to look, as is our MO, we're going to look back whenever things are referenced, like especially referencing literature. We tend to go back to the original work and see if there's any credence to those claims and see what we can glean from the literature itself, from the text. And we're going to do a pretty full explication of this book. Again, you probably have read this book. If you haven't read this book, then maybe this will be revelatory to you, and it'll be some new stuff. But this is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published in 1925. It takes place in 1922, of course, when The Wasteland was published. It sort of is. It's usually called the novel of the 1920s. It sort of typifies the Roaring Twenties. It gets all of the flapper era Roaring Twenties tropes that we now know. It's takes place in 1922, so it's 100 years, right? That's reason enough, I guess, why we should be going over that. Of course, published in 25, but it's 100 years since the events in the book take place in the world of the novel. Some call it the Great American Novel. I would not call it that. Moby Dick, The Scarlet Letter, and others are usually called the Great American Novel. This book is probably the Great American Novel of the 20th century, or at least the modernist era. And it is a truly modern book in terms of modernity. We'll get to that in a second. There are many themes that we can get from that we're going to analyze about this book: reality versus illusion. Of course, the old sort of normie way of analyzing this, which is, the old money versus nouveau-riche, the American dream, the capitalism in its sort of 20th century infancy. But we're going to get past that. And we're going to go a little bit deeper and talk about some of the more interesting or spicy things that I got from this book. I'll make mention of the films. There are two films. One is Robert Redford. And that film, actually, it's from the 70s. That film was the screenplay for that film was written by Francis Ford Coppola, which is pretty cool. Ratsky said, "I thought Infinite Jest was a great American novel." Yes. I got a lot to say about Infinite Jest. And shout out to Royce and Mersch. I think I said this before that Royce on Revenge of the Sith, Royce said that anybody who does a stream with a bookcase in the background and has Infinite Jest placed in a prominent position is full of shit. So, and I actually totally agree with him on that. But so let's dive into this. So again, before we get started, yes, thank you for dropping the links. And I listen. I don't know what I don't know what I'd do without you guys. Because you are how I'm surviving right now, and I really appreciate you. And I'm going to give a special shout out in a few minutes to everybody who's supported me, especially from the last streams. Please look in the channel description or in the video description if you're watching this later and see my PayPal, Cash App, Venmo links. I really appreciate your support, and it's going to allow us to keep going. As I've said before, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to keep going regardless because I love doing this, and I love just talking about literature, worldviews, meaning, right? Meaning in literature. And let me crack that old Red Bull up. Let me drink this GMO Red Bull so I can get going, you guys. Special shout out before I forget to Slow Boy Whiteboard, our girl, yes, girl, Kristen, our home girl, who posted an awesome clip video. I really appreciate you, Kristen, and I love the comments, especially love the the Aaron Rodgers comment. That one was pretty funny. So yeah, I got a big kick out of that. So thank you, and also yes, Kristen, you clearly did put my name, my channel as the first three words in the title. So yes, you definitely. I never considered at all that you weren't putting that up there with my channel name on there so people can go to it. I really appreciate you, and I saw it, of course. So thank you. I love you, and I really appreciate you doing that. That was a lot of fun. Okay, so let's get into it. The Great Gatsby, published in 1925. This book is dedicated once again to Zelda Fitzgerald, who was F. Scott Fitzgerald, his wife. I guess I'll preface this analysis by talking a little bit about Fitzgerald and his biography. He lived from 1896, I think, to 1940, if I remember off the top of my head. He was, of course, married to Zelda. He published a bunch of work. Tender as the Night, The Beautiful and the Damned, The Last Tycoon, and a bunch of great short stories. I'm just disclaimer. I am not really a fan of F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm not a fan of F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway. I have reasons for that. It's not just my dumb opinion. I have actual reasons for that. And I've talked about Ernest Hemingway before. I tend to like Ernest Hemingway. I don't dislike him simply because everybody talks about him and loves him. That would be kind of lame to do so. I dislike him because I think that his work, again, sort of insists upon itself. I like his philosophy of writing. I like his purity of line, right? And his, his stiff upper lip and his adherence to strict, simple and simple sentences, right? No fluff. I just tend to not I don't enjoy myself when I'm reading his work. People talk about Ernest Hemingway as if they're thrilled, right, by his work, and I don't find it thrilling at all. I do like The Sun Also Rises. I think it's a great book. Excuse me. And the pollen is covering everything, you guys. I don't know where you guys live, but everything is completely just covered in pollen here. So anyway, whatever. And my favorite Ernest Hemingway book, I've read The Old Man and the Sea about 400 times. I don't like the book, but I actually have read it that many times. You can read it in a couple hours. And my favorite Ernest Hemingway book is actually A Movable Feast. If I was going to excuse me, I can't talk. If I was going to recommend a book from the 1920s, the Lost Generation, a work of prose, I would recommend. I think everybody should read these books because they are seeped into the consciousness of, especially of this country, so much But I would recommend A Movable Feast because it was published posthumously and it's Ernest Hemingway's autobiographical work about living in Paris as an expatriate. And he actually in that book talks a lot about Fitzgerald. And he was not really a fan of Fitzgerald. Some have claimed that maybe Hemingway had a gay affair with F. Scott Fitzgerald. That may be so. I mean, I would say that's actually probable. But he talks a lot in the book about how he thinks that F. Scott Fitzgerald is he's effeminate essentially. He doesn't like that he's like sickly all the time, and that mainly was a lot of that was brought on by Fitzgerald's champagne alcoholism. If you didn't know that, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda were champagne alcoholics. I remember learning that in I guess maybe 11th grade. In 11th grade, I remember my teacher telling me that they were champagne alcoholics, and that was the worst alcoholic you could be because of the bubbles and the sugar. And of course, we're all adults here, folks. We've drank some Andre before, right? So yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree that that's probably pretty serious, and it goes to the state of mind of the 1920s, of course, and the lost generation, and his emphasis. Fitzgerald is like living out this life of the riche, right? That's not an expression, but I'll say it. And Fitzgerald, of course, went to Yale. He was, as JD calls him, a Yali. He went to Yale. I don't know for sure whether Fitzgerald was in Skull and Bones or not. I don't think he was, and I doubt that he was. But he was. He certainly was a Yale. He went to Yale. The characters in this book also went to Yale. That plays a major part in the narrative. He fought in the war. He was in the Great War. And like Nick Carraway says in this book, basically, he went to the war to try to die on the front. And of course, he died. He died pretty young. But one thing about The Great Gatsby is that after its publication, it really didn't do well. He actually turned down a number of offers from publishers. The book was going to be serialized, and he turned that down. And essentially turned it down for a deal that would net him about $1 million. The book did not really sell very well. It was critically accepted. Okay, it wasn't like panned or anything. But the reason it became really famous was because during World War II, so Fitzgerald was dead. The book was handed out to troops for one of those programs where they send troops abroad, like entertainment, right? Like how in the War on Terror, right? They were like, "Oh, send us your DVDs, so the troops can have all the DVDs. We need as many copies of Black Hawk Down as we can get," right? Well, they did that with The Great Gatsby, and that's supposedly why it started to sell incredibly well. Of course, this is probably just another aspect of culture creation. But yeah, so it didn't really do but it's come to be, it's obviously in the canon of literature. And I will say about this book that it is written beautifully in a number of ways. I mean, the language, there are passages in the book which are so beautifully written that they are masterful. And it's so good that now that they have again seeped into our language and cultural consciousness, they're almost cliche when you hear them, some of the lines. And you may have heard some of these passages and not even realize that they're from The Great Gatsby. But the opening of this book, and especially the closing of the book, are really, really spectacular. I really appreciate that. And there are a few very poetic and lyrical passages in the book, which we'll discuss. But the reason that I came to, the first time I read this book way back when, I really didn't like it that much. And as I've said before, I don't read like for fun. When I'm reading, I tend to stay away from fiction unless I'm reading it purposefully, like I did today with this book. But it didn't grab me. It's not as visceral as it sort of purports to be. And I think that a lot of that is probably due to the fact that there are a lot of inferences that you don't get when you're a teenager, when you're reading the book, even though you can appreciate it, you don't, and then I came to like it. And I really like a specific passage in this book, which is lyrical and beautiful, but Then I came to hate the book. I really hated The Great Gatsby and I hated Fitzgerald. And that's because essentially nothing really happens in the book. And there's obviously there's no like there's no positivity, there's no salvation, there's no worldview that appeals to me in any way in this book. I do appreciate its sort of picturesque ability to capture a specific time and place, which stands for really the 20s itself. But again, I don't really. I like the book again better now rereading it because of what I found in it. But it's not a book that I like. Oh, I'm like, oh, this is my favorite book. In fact, I tend to think that when people are like, "Oh, The Great Gatsby is my favorite book," it's like, is that because it's one of the only books you've read? If it is one of your favorite books, I'm not trying to denigrate that. I think that there's a lot to love about this book. All right, so I'm going to stop babbling now and let's actually look at the text. Okay, so here we go with The Great Gatsby. All right, so it begins. Chapter 1. He says, "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone," he told me, "just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had." So we start off right away with a character speaking in the first person, and we know that he is advantaged, right? He is privileged. Now, that I'm only bringing that up. I wouldn't ordinarily care about that sort of shit, but I mean, excuse me, that sort of stuff. But what I'm saying is that the reason I'm going to mention it is because it plays into the narrative. It plays into that is one of the themes, and the average the average analysis of this book will always go to the idea of nouveau-riche versus old money. Okay, so just to break that down a little bit, what does that mean? Well, in the 1920s, okay, when the book takes place, what is nouveau-riche? It's a French term for basically it literally translates as the new rich, but what it really means is, I find this actually pretty appealing because I sort of know about this. I don't know why, folks. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying, um, what it means essentially is that there are characters in the book, such as Nick Carraway, who is the speaker. He's the one speaking right now. The book's written in first person. His role. He sort of plays the role of a Greek chorus or a reliable narrator. He's a third party, and actually, he plays the third wheel throughout the book. But he is privileged in the sense that he comes from a fairly upper middle class family in the, as he calls it, Middle West. He's from Kentucky. He's from Louisville. He's from Louisville. And this ties into, again, this theme that we've seen recently with like T.S. Eliot coming from Missouri. We mentioned Mark Twain. A lot of this plays into the theme of East versus West and going West. And then later in the book with the idea of East Egg and West Egg. So we have this sort of dichotomy set up, right? We have when he gets to Nick Carraway is going to talk about how he went off to war. He went to a fine enough school, and then he went off to war. When he got out of the war, he went back home, and then his father said that he would support him for a year as a bond salesman. He's going to go basically work on Wall Street in New York. Now, this may sound to some people like he's incredibly privileged, and that's okay if you think that may be true. But I can just say that I can relate to this in a number of ways. Not the selling bonds on Wall Street, but in terms of I lived in New York for a year, and I supported myself through. I sold stocks that I shouldn't say this, but I sold stocks that I inherited from a long time ago, and that supported me. Just that alone supported me for a year living in New York. I was still working. I actually had 3 jobs at once, and I was trying to act. But anyway, my point is that he gets there, and then he comes across what's his name, Tom Buchanan, and Tom Buchanan is set up as the kind of the villain in this novel. But Tom Buchanan is what you call old money. He lives in a fabulously wealthy house in East Egg, which is the eggs in the book sort of stand for, as we would call them, the Hamptons. We think of the Hamptons, right? Pat Buchanan, Chad. The Hamptons didn't really exist so much then, but it is a section of Long Island, which is like Great Neck, New York, and whatever. We can just think of it as the Hamptons. And Tom Buchanan is the sort of guy who has inherited generational wealth and is so fabulously wealthy that he will never come to any harm, and he doesn't really work. He's almost like he's almost like a landed gentry, like a he just takes care of the house and the property. Okay, that's all. That's his job. In fact, it's crass to even talk about a job to a person like that, because there's the job they think is sort of beneath them. They don't talk about like jobs. Okay, and so he is part of this old money system. Then we have Jay Gatsby, and we're going to see that he is nouveau-riche. That's the crux of what I'm going to talk about tonight, why he is nouveau-riche and why he doesn't fit in. But suffice it to say that he has made his money recently. And the analogy I would draw to this would be like if you were at Augusta, down there in Georgia watching the Masters last weekend, right? And you had to, let's say you decided, your son wanted to run for office. He wanted to run for office. And of course, you needed to clean that record up a little bit. So they advised you need to forfeit your Augusta membership because it looks bad that they won't accept women folk on the property. So you decline your Augusta membership, right? And yet here comes Mark Zuckerberg trying to play golf. Well, of course, Mark Zuckerberg has the money that he does, but no matter what, people like that are not going to fit in at the old money club. They just don't. And now that I'm not offering a value judgment on that. I'm just saying that there are sort of two separate things. There are two separate clubs. Okay. And they can probably be members. They can buy their way in. It's almost like also in England, you hear about these people who buy a hereditary title, right? Well, yes, they may be made a peer. They may buy into it, but they are not ever going to be part of the club. And that also ties in with Jay Gatsby and one of his expressions. It's famously, Jay Gatsby calls people old sport throughout the book. And my theory about this has always been that that's a window into how he doesn't fit in, because he's kind of confusing two expressions. He's confused. I mean, Tom actually calls him out on it in the book, but he actually says, where'd you get that expression? When you were at Oxford, he calls him out because Gatsby claims to have been an Oxford man, even though he didn't go to Oxford. He spent 6 months at Oxford. He didn't read English at Oxford, right? And he's confusing the expressions old boy and sport. Sport is like anybody who grew up in the 80s, like, right, especially if you're a dude, you remember people do y'all remember being at the country club and somebody would come up to you and say, hey, sport, how you doing? How about we get you want me to enter you in the Bantam Boys tournament this weekend so you can play doubles with Mercer, right? And old boy is the old boy network, right? If you are, okay, we're a little pixelated. Okay, yeah. Hopefully we're still rolling. Hopefully volume's good. We should be good. That's probably just the Appalachia standing air clogged with pollen, right? The old boy network is, if you are a member of the old clubs, right? The Athenaeum, etc. in London, right? You are part of the old boy network. And Jay has gone into this brilliantly. Jay and Tristan also, Tristan's also gone into this. How a lot of the old boy networks, even the ones in America, the Anglo-American establishment, the Anglo-American networks, were also involved. A lot of their money was involved with the opium trade, right? And that's going to play a major part in this book. So let's see. He says, we're still in the first chapter here, by the way. I'm sorry, I'm babbling away. I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I feign sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. So, what he's saying here is Nick Carraway is saying he is constantly a confidant for people. People, he just happens to have the personality in the face. It's almost beta in a way because he's a passive personality that means that other people are going to confide in him, and he would even fake it to try and get out of their confidences. But it's interesting that the very first page of this novel talks about confidence and about being a politician and about knowing people's secrets, right? The title that I put here, the subtitle of the stream, is Jepstein Effrey, and that's going to play a role in this. Okay, so he says, let's see. He goes on, he says, after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. Remember, it's written in 1925. It's pretty cool. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby. Let's see. What? I can't read because it's crossed out with my notes. Dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. In other words, what he's saying here, it's interesting. Right there, we sort of debunk the way most people think about Great Gatsby because they think that Nick Carraway and Jay Gatsby are friends. And they are sort of friends, but they're friends in a certain way. And he states right from the beginning of the book that he does not admire Gatsby. He says it throughout the book. He doesn't like him. He doesn't admire him. And his famous quote at the end of the book would seem to contradict that. But we'll see that he actually just doesn't like any of these people. And in fact, one of the central tenets of my thesis tonight is that none of the people in this book are good. They're all pretty shitty people. There's nobody that's admirable in the book. There's nobody. I mean, Nick has the most admirable qualities, I guess, of anyone, because at least he cares. But nobody in this book is good. Nobody's virtuous. They're all pretty shitty people. And that's purposeful because it's talking about the book is about the Valley of Ashes. It's about the sort of wasteland of modernity. Let's see. He says, I graduated from New Haven in 1915. There's the sign of somebody who went to Yale. He graduated from New Haven. They call it New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father. And a little later, I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me and finally said, why, yes, with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east. Permanently, I thought, in the spring of 1922. So the book takes place in 1922. Okay. Yes. Let's see. And again, 1922 wasteland. We get the wasteland of the Great War. We get the no man's land. We get a statement really on the lost generation itself, right? Although he doesn't really talk about the war, how most people talk about the lost generation coming back shell shocked. He actually says that he enjoyed it. He moves to a place called West Egg. Now, West Egg is basically, I would call it West Hampton. In the book, it's not actually specifically Hampton, but that's the way we could think about it. Now, East Hampton and West Hampton on Long Island. And if you've never been to New York or you know nothing about Long Island, you have 5 boroughs of New York. Forgive me if this is really elementary. You have 5 boroughs of New York City that comprise New York City. You have Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx and Staten Island, and then Long Island is sort of separate. At the very edge of Long Island, on the east tip, you have Montauk. We just talked about Stranger Things over on my Instagram Live, where the Montauk base was, and it's like a surfing village. On the other end, you have like Wantagh, and Long Island if you've ever seen, for instance, The Wolf of Wall Street, that's where what's his name from The Wolf of Wall Street lives. That's where a lot of people who work in New York City live, on Long Island, if they can afford it. But even the commute from Long Island to Manhattan, which is not very far, can take like 2 hours on the LIRR. And a lot of people, New York is so big. Manhattan itself is so big. It's not actually big by geography, and it's an island, but it's big in terms of, the population is enormous. It has the biggest population of any city in the country, but a lot of people are commute and they live outside of it, right? People live as far away as like Philadelphia, just to work in New York. So he actually finds a place in West Egg, which is like a little house between two gigantic mansions. And he lives in West Egg, and then that's going to be distinct from East Egg. And we're going to see the whole thing with the green light in a minute, and it's across the little bay. But the East and the West are the dialectic in this book, because the East obviously represents the old, the origin. It's also where the war was. And then we have the West, which is America itself. But then in the context of the book, it's the Midwest and then the West Coast. Well, they don't even get as far as the West Coast. But when we should think about that in terms of like the like go West young man mentality, right? Horatio Alger and Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson and all the stuff that we've read. And we're going to see that to go East is to make money, is to get into, to transcend your station in life, in terms of the class system, the class structure. And that we're going to see that by the end, Nick Carraway, the speaker, will rebel against that and will go back West. Okay. And also Jay Gatsby himself is from the West. Tom Buchanan is from Chicago, but that doesn't count really as the West because he's part of the establishment. He's part of the elite. So he's sort of cosmopolitan. He can, as it says in the book, he can fly off to France at a moment's notice for any reason. And eventually when he and Daisy get in trouble, or when there's trouble in their life, they'll simply take off to Monte Carlo and let it pass, and then they'll come back. Let's see. It says, let's see. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money. He specifically mentions it, from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan knew. J.P. Morgan, right? Let's see. It may seem weird that his house, this little house, is in between these gigantic mansions, but that's still a thing. I mean, I lived in a carriage house behind two mansions for many years, and you can still have these little places, even though they can be on, like, for instance, like on Embassy Row in DC. My shirt is like being weird. Sorry. Y'all like my shirt here? Let's see my shirt. Right, it's Mississippi Aquarium. Make sure you go to the Mississippi Aquarium, you guys. All right, so let's see. He says, but now he left Chicago. He's talking about Tom Buchanan here. Now he left Chicago and okay. Oh, so he talked about Daisy. Daisy is Nick's second cousin once removed, and she is the female protagonist in this book. And she's the one that Gatsby falls in love or was already in love with. But her husband, here we go. Let's describe her husband, Tom. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reach an acute limited excellence at 21, that everything afterwards savors of anti-climax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason and then drifted here and there unrestfully whenever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrevocable football game. Now, that plays into the fact that Tom, throughout this book, is sort of the elites have this sort of contemptuous sneer about them. Tom, especially, he's described as a hulking figure, and he sort of dominates any situation he's in. And that's because of his breeding and his money, right? His position. And he knows that he is completely insulated from trouble. It says he had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. 2 shiny, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. I love that description. That's pretty cool, right? Gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. That is a great example of showing in writing rather than telling, right? He's showing us what this guy's like, and he doesn't need to tell us what he means by it. He says he had a body, enormous power in his body. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. And there were men at New Haven who hated his guts. I totally understand what they mean. As I've said before, I prepped. I was raised in prep school and was educated at some of the finest institutions. And I completely know what he means here. That even when talking with your friends, you sort of have this air of contempt. One way you can tell that he's old money, as you keep going on, is when he describes his house. The front yard of his house is half a mile long and goes straight up to the beach, and he's got stables and polo grounds and all this stuff. But one thing that he says is, he'll say something like, "Do you like my little place here?" And he doesn't mean it facetiously. He means it literally. He's saying, "Do you like my little place?" There's not an air of, "Do you like my fabulously wealthy mansion?" If somebody says, "Where'd you get it?" He'll say something like, "It belonged to Domain, the oil man." Like as if everybody would know who that is, right? Oh, it belonged to the oil man, right? Like a tycoon. He's not going to, there's no reason for him to put on airs because he has already got it. He doesn't need to put anything on. Whereas the nouveau-riche guy is Jay Gatsby, who will describe in detail everything that he has. He'll say how much his car costs. He'll say, where he went to school and how much it cost him. He'll say how many shirts he has, how many suits he has from Savile Row. He'll enumerate everything. Whereas the old money people will never do that. It's crass. It's just accepted. Now, that's not to say that Tom is not crass, because he is, and we're going to see what that means. We get a description of the 2 women. 2 young women were buoyed up as through upon an anchor balloon. Let's see. We get a description of Jordan, who is the second. She would be the best supporting actress in this cast, right? If it were up for awards, Jordan Baker, and she's a female professional golfer who is also a notable liar. We find out that she is a liar, and there's, there is clearly in this book, there is a dichotomy between the reliable narrator of Nick and the unreliable characters. They are called out specifically for their lying and for their dishonesty and their dishonest actions. Man, I guess I getting pollen in my throat, y'all. Let's see. Down on page 9, it says, when Nick goes in and he meets Daisy, who's his cousin, and he just happens to come across Tom and Nick and Daisy and Jordan. And here's another thing: when he walks into the room and he meets them, they act like they've always known him. They've always Marlboro's pollen now. That's right. I got to cure it. Hold on. Philip Morris is going to cure this for me real quick. All right, that makes it feel better. No, but so they act like they've known Nick forever and that they were just hanging out with him. They probably, Daisy hasn't seen this guy in years, and he'll walk into the room and they'll say, "Oh, what are you up to tonight?" Like they've always been friends and like they're hanging out, right? but that's because they have this sort of supercilious manner. And it's important that on page 9 it says the whole town is desolate. That's the way Jordan describes the place, because because desolation and wasteland play a huge role in this in the text. Let's see. It says there's a great description here. Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square, which I think is a wonderful and accurate description of the power of this guy and his position. And also that we can't help but think of the grand chessboard, right? And think of Miles Copeland and the Old Boy Network and the grand chessboard in the Game of Nations. Yes. And how these people, one of the other themes in the book is control, is the idea of control and people relinquishing control, and people gaining control over other human beings. And obviously, Tom is the alpha in this situation. He's dominating everybody and he moves him, but it's not like he's on a chessboard. So I like what Fitzgerald does here. He flips it from the normal, what would sort of be a cliche, right? From the chessboard to the checkers. It makes it a little softer. It makes it a little more like, okay, he's dealing with human beings here rather than the grand chessboard of, of a Game of Nations. Also, checkers reminds me of, checkers is not the innocent form of chess in terms of geopolitics. Remember that where Enigma was broken and where Special Operations Executive and MI6 were stationed, were headquartered during World War II, was at Checkers. It was called Checkers. That's Winston Churchill's place, right? It says down on the bottom of page 11, we ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What do we do? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an awed expression on her little finger. This is like general malaise. And then later they say, you did it, Tom. I know you didn't mean to, but you did it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking specimen of a, I hate that word hulking, said Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Well, it says, a bantering in consequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. A great dramatization of this, rather than watching the terrible Great Gatsby film, which is, I get it, it's kind of an impressionistic Baz Luhrmann view of how the book goes, but it's not really accurate. It doesn't really get it. It does too much, as they say. And a better representation of the Great Gatsby in a lot of ways would be American Psycho, the American Psycho film, because of how there's a misrepresentation. People are impersonalized and they mistake each one, right? Remember how they mistake Pat. Hi, I'm Pat Bateman. He's Patrick Bateman, then he's Pat Bateman. Then he's Halberstram. He's Marcus Halberstram, right? Then he's Paul Allen. Nobody knows anybody else's name, even when they're friends. Yes. And let's see. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the COLORED? I'm not going to say that on stream. Empires by this man, Godard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. In other words, he's surprised that Tom actually reads. Now, Tom, as we'll see, is actually kind of a conspiracy theorist. And he's clearly marked out by the speaker and by Fitzgerald as the villain by this next page, where he is clearly interested in eugenics. Okay. But the difference is that Tom is talking about things in terms of a conspiracy theory, whereas he is probably actually involved, well, at least through third parties, in the things themselves. But we're going to see that Gatsby is an actual conspiracist. And that is one of the reasons why he has such contempt for him, even though we're going to see later Gatsby will call out Tom for being in the same circles, even though they are worlds apart, they're in the same circles. But the difference is that Tom does not stoop to Gatsby's level to getting his hands dirty. That's the only difference between the two. On page 13, he's going to talk about basically eugenics. I'm not going to go into that or quote it. just for the sake of the stream. But later it says, but basically, Tom is interested in that. And um, what was one of the things? We're gonna. Oh, and no, I'll get to that later. But what he is interested in is that he's basically saying that his way of life is gradually being taken over because of the progress of modernity, and he is interested in that. He's been reading about it. Let's see. They mentioned the Cunard and the White Star Line, which is just right before, right? This is what, 1914? So it's only a few years before that. Then later they say on page 15, Tom's got some woman in New York because the butler comes in and pulls Tom away and they talk in hushed whispers, hushed tones. And then Jordan will say, can't she have more discretion in that? So it's an open secret that Tom is cheating on his wife with this girl, Myrtle, that we're going to see. Let's see. Okay, page 16. Let's see. She says, oh, why didn't I see you before this? And he says, and Nick says, well, I wasn't back from the war yet. And it's like, oh, that's inconsequential to the ladies, right? That he was off to war. Of course, I don't think Tom was in the war because he sent a proxy, right? He's obviously too wealthy to be going to the war. He probably made money off the war. On the bottom of page 16, it'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. This is Daisy talking about her own child. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. So with that statement, we get this idea that, what's my note here? She wakes up out of the ether as if reborn and hopes her child remains in an innocent state of abandon. This is almost an Edenic idea, like untainted by knowledge, but the fact is that it's kind of insidious how she says this, right? She wishes her child to be to be untainted by experience in the world. But to me, that seems sinister because who's the one who's going to ruin her innocence? Well, it's the very people that she is in cahoots with in this family. Even though I'm sure her child will be insulated through her education and everything, but still, there's very little of that in the book, of her interactions with her own children. And again, that points to what we've said about the idea of the elites sending their children off to boarding school at age 5, and being educated in this sort of psychopathic system without a maternal instinct so they can run the empire. Let's see. Her lovely face as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged, the idea of secret societies. Notice, by the way, I will say about the movie that I think that Tom, who's played by Joel Edgerton in the movie, he also, as we just discussed, he went to Yale. And in the film, all of his suits have a skull and bones on them. Did you notice that in the film? He's obviously a bonesman. Nick is obviously not a bonesman, even though he went to Yale. Let's see. I was assumed reading this that Nick was gay, because of his sort of his beta mentality and the fact that he's a confidant and that he doesn't have everyone in the book sort of has a sex drive except for him. And we'll get to a scene in a second, which seems to support that theory. Even though later on I think he does have interaction with Jordan, but I also assumed that Jordan was a lesbian in the book because of how she's described. She's a professional golfer and all this stuff. And I'm not trying to characterize her. I'm just saying. Let's see. Their interest. So Nick leaves and he says, their interests rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms. Let's see. Something was making him nibble at the edge of the stale ideas as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. Now that is lyrical. That is beautiful. There's often notice that all of the beautiful descriptions in this book, especially of landscape and nature, take place at night. Right? It's a very it's it's like a I don't know. It's Sylvan, right? It's like the Sylvan scene of Artemis, and they're always because they're always describing the moon and the way the moon looks. Um, let's see. Okay, so here's the famous passage. I decided to call to him. Let's see. So he goes down to the dock and he sees, I guess, Gatsby himself. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and as far as I was for him, I could have sworn he was trembling, fear and trembling, right? Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of the dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. That's the end of chapter 1, and that's every sort of chapter, and the entire book is bookended with these lyrical passages. And what I see there is people often wonder, what is the symbolism of the green light in The Great Gatsby? And I see that I keep freezing up a little bit. Hopefully my voice is all right and I'm not roboting, but let me know if I am. So the green light, what's the symbolism of the green light at the end of the dock? Well, the green light obviously represents youth, vitality, right? Bloom. Remember we talked about Dylan Thomas and the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. But it also represents, as he later says in the book, the green breast of the new continent. In other words, it's west, right? And Gatsby is looking eastward. He's looking back in time. Okay. So the east is the original, and then they go west. Gatsby comes from the west, and he's looking eastward towards the Buchanan's mansion. But that symbolizes the fact that, as Gatsby later says, he wants to live in the past. Because that's when he first fell in love with Daisy. He wants to capture in perpetuity the moment where he kissed Daisy and they heard the sound of a tuning fork struck upon the star. He wants to go back, right? And this is sort of the inversion of, imagine the Godspeed on the way to Jamestown, right, in 1607, and looking at as he says in the book, the green breast of the new continent. So it's like youth and vitality. I would also say that green in this weirdly represents it. To me, it's always been a Luciferian image. I say that because of emerald, and I think it's in Wolfram. It's a weird reference to throw out there, but Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, which Wagner's Parsifal opera in the Ring Cycle was based upon. And in that book, the Holy Grail is described as I think it's green. It's a green space rock, but it's like a Luciferian space rock. And I also always think of like the green vapors of Dracula in the movie Dracula. Now, those are pretty far out images to sort of collate into my interpretation of this, but I'm sort of vindicated here because notice that they talk about the abyss. Gatsby is standing on the edge of the abyss. He's literally looking out into the darkness of night and the dark sea, and he's calling out, right? He's reaching out to his love across the abyss. And his whole point is he has to cross the abyss. This is the Luciferian Paradise Lost Crowleyan image of crossing the abyss. Yeah. Let's look at chapter 2. And just on the first page of chapter 2, I mean, it's chock full of imagery. So let's see. I'm just going to read some of chapter 2 here, the first couple pages. And I'm trying not to get bogged down with the beginning of the book because there's so much imagery in the rest of the book and so much that we can glean from it. So I'm going to read some of chapter 2, and then I'm going to kind of scan through the rest and get to the Jepstein Effrey parts. Okay, so it says, about halfway between West Egg and New York, a motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. It's the second time the word desolate has been used in this book. This is a valley of ashes. A fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air, while screens their obscure operations. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive for a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non existent nose. Evidently, some wild wag of an occultist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens and then sank down himself into eternal blindness or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many painless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. This is a hellscape. So between East Egg and West Egg, East Hampton and West Hampton, there is this is where what is it? There's a town built there on top of what was the actual Valley of Ashes now. Can't remember what it is, but the point is that figuratively, this is a few things. This represents, we've got the past and the future, and in the middle, we've got the abyss, right? We've got vitality and life, and we've got control, and we've got a death ground in the middle. We've got World War I and the Germans and the English, right, or the Allies, and we've got no man's land in between. We've got the T.S. Eliot wasteland. We have the wasteland of modernity. And over the eyes of this, so what they're describing is an ad, and it has these two eyes with spectacles, and there's no nose, and it's Billy Idol, right? It's eyes without a face. And the eyes, you can't help but think of a few things here. You think of the eyes of Big Brother watching you, because later on, what's his name? Wilson will describe, he'll smash Myrtle's face into the window, making her look both out at the future and at herself in the reflection, right? Confronting her own personality in the midst of confronting herself in the abyss. And he'll say, the eyes are always watching you. He says, no matter what you do, God can always see you. Now, well, Wilson's a schizoid, so he's starting to believe that the eyes are the eyes of God. But we can't help but think of the all-seeing eyes, because whenever they cross through this abyss, they are watched, and they loom over everything. Also, the yellow spectacles remind me of the way that the eyes are described as yellow in Frankenstein. And we also saw that in Animal Farm. Do you remember how we saw the eyes, the eyes, the yellow eyes? So to me, this is sort of like the diseased eyes of the all-seeing eyes watching over you. Yeah. We also have, it also reminds me of the Dark Satanic Mills, William Blake's Dark Satanic Mills in Jerusalem, in the poem Jerusalem, right? Because this is a dumping ground. It's desolation. Also, we had the mention of the occult, right? And this is where Tom confronts, Tom Buchanan is having an affair with this girl named Myrtle, okay? And that makes me think of like a crepe myrtle tree, and how the crepe myrtle can be, the red blossom of the crepe myrtle. And also in the film, Myrtle is a scarlet woman. So she lives in the abyss, and she is a scarlet woman. In the book, she's wearing blue. And it says, let's see. Oh, okay. So Tom goes up, and they stop at this gas station that's in the wasteland, in the Valley of Ashes. And Tom's like, oh, I got to go in to pay. But really, he's going in to see his mistress, who is Myrtle. And then they're going to take her, and they're going to go into town and go to a bordello. Okay. They're going to go to a whole whorehouse up in New York, or an apartment that Tom owns, right, in New York. Later on in the book, they go to the Plaza Hotel. I'll tell you about the Plaza in just a little bit. And Wilson, her husband, is a total cuck, and he realizes he's been cucked, but not by, he never realizes he's been cucked by Tom Buchanan. But notice this, and here's where I get one of the themes in the book: the difference between the hidden, we just saw there's wild wag of an occultist. So we get this dichotomy between the hidden and the visual. And that is, it says, let's see, he says, the gas station, the interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hand on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. His light blue eyes reflect the blue eyes of T.J. Eichelberg watching them. Also, the word blind is there, right? So we have eyes and blind. We have the idea of the blind seer. Again, remember going back to T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, right? And Sophocles. Remember in Sophocles, in Oedipus Rex, right? The blind seer who convinces Oedipus that there is a plague, right? And then he has to solve the plague, and then eventually Oedipus stabs out his own eyes. We also have the fact that the entire thing is a blind, meaning it is a front. Nick Carraway specifically says here, he thinks that the garage itself is a front. It's a front for a bordello. Now, it may or may not be. We don't know. I would assume that it probably is, because that's where Tom has gotten the Scarlet Woman. And I hope I'm not, I see on my other screen here, I'm kind of fading in and out. So hopefully I'm still doing well, and hopefully I'm not roboting too much. Let's see. Down at the bottom of page 25, the description of Myrtle. It says, she was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously as some women can. I think of her as she's almost like a whore of Babylon here, right? Her face above a spotted dress of dark blue, crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but it is dark blue, mirroring the eyes, right? The eyes of T.J. Eichelberg, the big brother eyes watching them all. But there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. Why does he say smoldering? Because they're in the Valley of Ashes. Everybody here that they've come across in this valley looks like some sort of spirit, specter, or demon, even Wilson himself, right? And then it says on page 26, she smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips and, without turning around, spoke to her husband in soft, coarse voice. Get some chairs, why don't you? As somebody can sit down. He says, oh, sure. Then it says, to describe him, he is so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. So now I'm starting to think that the description of Wilson, the husband of Myrtle, is like he's described almost consciously like the stupid epsilons in Brave New World, remember? Right? They're just wasteoids. This guy's just a wasteoid. He's an empty shell. Later on page 27, we backed up to a gray old man. Everything's gray in this wasteland, who bore an absurd resemblance to, guess whom? John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. This guy's, he's hawking puppies, and they buy one, right? Then it says, okay, so then they go into the city, and they basically go to a whorehouse, and they try to hook up Nick with a girl. He's not very interested. He starts reading a book called Simon Called Peter, right? He's looking for meaning. He's looking for some sort of meaning here in the midst of this hellscape. In comes Catherine with a sticky bob of red hair. So she's also a Scarlet Woman. It says her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again in a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. Again, eyes without a face. This guy called Mr. McKee was a pale feminine man from the flat below, and he's in the artistic game. All right, here's where we go into Jepstein Effrey territory, guys. Are you ready for this? The photographer comes in. If you've never seen, you guys ever seen those videos of Rusty Nelson, who claims to have been an associate of Hunter S. Thompson? I would check those videos. They're probably still on YouTube. I would check them out because he was a photographer in 8mm territory. I'm not going to say anything else there, but this reminds me of that because this guy is described as kind of a creepazoid. And it says, Nick says, he informed me he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. They're all like ghostly demon creatures here, right? His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. With the influence of, let's see, she with the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. They change wildly, and then let's see. It says, "Oh, we get Montauk picture." Then they start talking about Gatsby, and the book is full of rumors about what he is. And I think that Gatsby is kind of all of these things that they describe him as. They say he's a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm. They say he's an associate of the Germans. He's a spy. He's all these things. He knows Hindenburg. He's related to Franz Ferdinand. And I think that may be the case. In the sense that Gatsby was in the American Expeditionary Forces, and he talks later on in the book about, he tries to give like his own, you know, CV, his curriculum vitae to Nick, and Nick doesn't believe, nobody ever believes him when he talks. And I think that plays into the sort of Jepstein Effrey esque description of him in the book. I mean, look, here's what I'm going to say about that. I think that this book exists, and this book is capturing certain people that did exist and were probably doing Epstein-esque activities in the day. I think that Gatsby is one of those people. He is clearly a trafficker in the book. I think that he's involved in multiple trafficking things, although it's never spoken. He is obviously involved in drugs or opium. He's a bootlegger. He talks about how he was in the oil business. It's mentioned that Tom later calls him out because they say he's an Oxford man. And he says, where? Oxford, New Mexico, like Zora Ranch, right? And Tom takes a dislike to him because he says that his activities are unsavory and disgusting. And I think that, so what I think is that the parallels between Jepstein Effrey and Jay Gatsby later on, like in our own lifetime, are purposeful. I think that he or the people that controlled or that made him purposefully fostered this image, which was very much like Gatsby. He is the role model for his character, because you can find countless articles discussing how he lives this Gatsby-esque life. In fact, there's even a description later on of, you remember Little St. James Island, right, from Epstein? Well, guess what? Gatsby has one, but it's described as, I gotta find this. It's described as Littlegirl Bay in the book. Can you believe that? The way that his main associates are mafiosi and are tied in with both intelligence and international trafficking, right? Specifically, this guy that we're going to meet, whose name is Meyer Wolfsheim. Now, Meyer Wolfsheim is a minor character in the role, but he plays a major role in the sense that he is a driving force behind this in the subtext of the book. When Gatsby later dies, spoiler alert, you know this anyway. When Gatsby is assassinated at the end of the book in a murder suicide, Nick will call up Meyer Wolfsheim and say, "Hey, did you know that he's dead?" And then Meyer Wolfsheim finally gets back to him after like weeks and says, "I didn't know his family, of course, because he's the associate." Even Gatsby's family Gatsby isn't his real name. His real name in the book is Gatz, Gatz, right? He makes himself he associates with somebody bigger who gets him into the finance industry, just like Jepstein Effrey with Bill Barr's dad. Hello, remember at Dalton School? And Meyer Wolfsheim is obviously supposed to be an amalgamation of Meyer Lansky and Arnold Rothstein. Because later on, when Gatsby takes Nick to a speakeasy and they're hanging out, and he says, and Wolfsheim, he asks, "Who is Wolfsheim?" And Wolfsheim says, Gatsby describes Wolfsheim as being the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. And he says, "What do you mean fixed? Why is he in jail?" And Gatsby says, "Oh, no, they can't get him." And what I get from that is, of course they can't get him because he's connected. Because all the power players are connected. When you watch the film, you see the police commissioner and you see all these people in there, right? Remember when they're going to pull over? It's not in the book, but they're going to pull over Gatsby and he shows them a card and it says Jay Gatsby. And then the cop says, never mind, see ya. Because it's a blackmail operation, right? It's a blackmail operation. He's got him. And Arnold Rothstein is the actual guy who fixed the 1919 World Series. And then what happens is, I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit here, but what happens is Gatsby takes him to the speakeasy and then tries to recruit Nick. He tries to recruit Nick into his business. And Nick says, I don't want anything to do with it. I don't know what it is. And then Gatsby says, oh, don't worry. You won't have to have anything to do with Wolfsheim. In other words, you're going to run some other operation or you'll be a mule or you'll be a front, right? The idea of fronts, again, illusion versus reality. And Gatsby needs somebody like Nick because he's innocent, right? He is uncompromised. He can be part of this operation. He needs a front man. And he can't have anything to do with Tom because Tom is part of the establishment that will have nothing to do with it, even though they do have a common guy and figure, which is, who's the guy in the book that they have in common, by the way? Can you get? You won't be able to guess, but the guy that they have in common is Walter Chase, is Chase Manhattan. So, because later on when they confront each other at the Plaza Hotel, and Nick is saying, so Tom Buchanan says, who are you anyway? And this guy wears pink suits. That's the best insult in the book, right? And it's actually true because that shows Gatsby's nouveau-riche attitude. Also, what does the pink suit symbolize? I think the pink suit symbolizes a sort of a, like he's almost like a Luciferian evening star. Everything about him is like fading into the evening in the book. And he's like an evening star that seduces people, right? He seduces people, but he's also separate from them because the way that Gatsby hangs around in his mansion and has these parties, but nobody ever sees him except for when Nick sees him upstairs in the window. It's almost like he's looking through the looking glass or he's looking through a telescope. He's looking at a celestial body that is apart from everyone, but it's actually Tom who is apart from everybody. He doesn't go to the parties either. He would never dare go to Gatsby's parties because Gatsby's parties are Operation Midnight Climax-esque blackmail operations. In fact, there's a whole page in this book where there's a list of, later on, Nick finds a list of all the people who visited Gatsby over the summer, and it's like hundreds of people, and they're all either celebrities, they're Hollywood, or they're finance, or they're mafia. Right. And Nick is honest in the book and doesn't know. He doesn't understand what's going on, but we can read into it and we know what's going on. Right. They're going to this place because that's the operation. Let's see. Gatsby was in the war. The way he introduces, he finally appears at the party just for Nick. And then he's always constantly called away from the party because he's being called by Chicago or Philadelphia or various places that he has business. Let's see. Here we go. I don't think he went to Oxford. Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man. Yeah, they keep talking about how they think Gatsby killed a man. Right. And they're kind of titillated by that. Right. And he said, I didn't believe they didn't, let's see, in his provincial experience, he didn't just drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. Anyhow, he gives large parties, and I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. Okay, so again, we get the paradox, right? The situational paradox, and we get the idea that, these people only feel safe at large parties where they can blend in, right? There's no privacy at the small party because then they have to be themselves. And later on, I think it's Jordan that says that. And later Jordan is going to talk about how Jordan, by the way, Jordan Baker in this book is the G-Max figure. She is the Ghislaine Maxwell figure in this because she is called away by Gatsby. She's constantly trying to set people up with other people. In fact, it says, Miss Baker, I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone. Then she comes back and sets up Nick with a young actress, it says. On page 52, let's see. Oh, it's no 53. It says Jay Gatsby says, "Don't mention it. Don't give it another thought. Old sport. The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder." And then 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. It becomes almost a Mask of the Red Death hellscape. And let's see. They go into the library, and there's a guy in the library called Owl Eyes that they refer to as Owl Eyes. And Owl Eyes, the owl is obviously, when I think of the owl, right, we think of Bohemian Grove, we think of Skull and Bones, we think of Pallas Athena, right, from the Poe stream. Remember, we talked about Pallas Athena and the owl. We talk about that was the raven, but the owl makes an appearance. We talk about the wise owl, and this guy's Owl Eyes says, "Can you believe it? All the books in this library are real." Right? They're not all the books. They're not, he says, they're not cardboard. Can you believe it? Because Gatsby has this fabulous library. Remember Jay in the stream earlier was talking about, if you go to a place and there are books, because most people don't have books, who wouldn't go in and check out the books in the library? I totally agree with him, obviously. I mean, look, but they go in and this guy's actually checking out the books, and he's like, look, these books aren't fake. So, but that doesn't mean that Gatsby himself isn't fake. In fact, he's acquired all of this stuff as a front to fit in to their society, right? This is like Jepstein Effrey's, house at whatever it is, 666 Park Avenue. I know that's Jared Kushner, but or it's like, Zorro Ranch or any of these places. It says, a sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host, who stood on the porch, his hand up in a formal gesture of farewell. What's he doing? Like a Masonic hand sign up there to say farewell to him. They later talk about the Yale Club. Jordan's a liar. Let's see. I hope I never will. I hate careless people. That's why I like you. So she's seducing him, by the way. Let's see. She's probably dishonest. Nick knows that, but the other people don't. I'm one of the few honest people that I've ever known, Nick says. Okay, here we go. With bootlegging and trafficking. Let's see. Page 62. Okay. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So some of the people that are introduced, Beluga, tobacco importers, Beluga's girls, it says, is one of the people that stopped by his place. Muldoon, who strangled his wife. I think of that movie with what's the name of the Count that strangled his wife, and he was represented by Dershowitz, and he was played by Jeremy Irons in the film. Remember, and that was set on Long Island, by the way. It was a real story that happened in the 80s. Let's see, theatrical people. Benny McClanahan, some guy, always arrived with 4 girls. Ernest Lilly, right? We get drug makers. We get, let's see, page 64. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. Gatsby was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere or the impatient opening of a closed hand. Let's see. A labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns is how he describes his car. Let's see. Okay, here we go about Gatsby. He had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded and had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. There you go. Nick is on to elaborate bordello trafficking operation scheme. He's got a nebulous backstory. He describes himself as having, he says, and I tried very hard to die at the front, at the war, but I seem to bear an enchanted life. There again, he sort of waters down the straight up Macbeth reference with I bear a charmed life, but he is charmed, right? And he does have a sort of enchanted life. Although, let's see, we get, 4 of them were electrocuted. There's constant weird mentions of death and murder throughout this. Let's see. No, Meyer Wolfsheim. No, he's a gambler. He's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. That's on page 73. They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man. Let's see. Jordan is born in 19 here, right? Death of Queen Victoria. But she is a minor when she moves. No, hold on. She's 18. Nick is the minor here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so we get the backstory for Daisy. So what happened with the backstory was that Gatsby, there are a few different versions of the backstory. They keep going further back, just like he wants to go further and further back in time, just like he wants to go further across the bay, right, to East Ag and the green light of youth and vitality. The entrancing green light, the sort of the green light of his own charisma that throughout the book hypnotizes everyone around him. They're all brought into his circle, except for Tom and Nick, even though Nick also is clearly brought into his circle, even though he reserves a sort of an objective dislike of him. Okay, here's a great quote on page 79. Here we go. Suddenly I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. He's talking about Jordan, who is the G-Max character. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. Here we go, you guys. Here's her quote. This is talking about the 4 types of people in the world. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I think that is an entirely psychopathic and predatory statement about the world. We skipped. Okay, I'll have to read it again. Again, that is an entirely predatory and psychopathic statement about the types of people in the world and the types, because they can put everybody into these 4 categories: the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. Well, we obviously get the prey, the predator, the managerial class, and the tired are either the people at the top or the bottom of the pyramid, right? The tired are the people who, the bell curve. Like, it's the people who they're running everything and they keep a hands off. That's pretty much Tom, right? I wrote, this sounds like both a statement of the malaise of modernity and an Operation Midnight Climax-esque phrase. It almost seems like an MK Ultra trigger phrase. The book reminds me in a lot of ways, whenever I get these modern books, like, we know specifically that from Martin Orne and Jose Delgado and these guys that The Wizard of Oz and Catcher in the Rye, right, with what's his name? What's the guy's name? Mark David Chapman, carrying Catcher in the Rye. We have these sort of trigger phrase books, which seem like the subtext is like a weird. They don't make sense in a way that's like there's some sort of sinister, like insidious undercurrent of the book. Like we're actually reading something else when we're reading it. Like we're reading Twilight language or something. And I think that The Great Gatsby fits into that in a lot of ways. And I would say, don't judge a book by its cover, but the cover was specifically chosen and designed. It was designed, I forget the guy's name who designed it, but it was chosen by Fitzgerald. And look at the eyes, right? We get the Lost Boys-esque, the circus of life, the Hall of Mirrors. You remember Jay did his streams on Nightmare Alley, and the circus represents a hellscape. And then we get the crying eyes with the diamond crying eyes of the occultic woman. And at the end of that chapter, he has sex with Jordan, Frozen. Okay, I cut out there for a second. Cut out there for a second. So should be back now. Wow. I don't know what's going on with the data you got. I mean, with the stream. Wow, I'm really losing my visual here. I'm sorry about that. So I guess I'll wrap it up now because it looks like I'm losing it here in terms of the quality. Tell me if you guys can still hear me. Yeah, the stream is getting throttled. Thank you, Natesky. Appreciate you. Okay, I'm sorry about that, you guys. I don't know what's going on. It says there's nobody in here either, which is weird. So sound is fine. Okay, good. Okay, let me wrap it up. Just a couple more things. Gatsby offers Nick a business role. Obviously as a front man or a patsy. On pages 81 and 82. On page 82, it says, the rain cooled about 3:30 to a damp mist, through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finish. So this reminds me of, Dalton School, and again with Jepstein Effrey, who is teaches economics and who is looking at this stuff with vacant eyes. He's a front man. He's a fixer. Let's see. Drug trafficking. Let's see. It says, it took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it. I thought you inherited your money. I did, old sport, but I lost. I was in the drug business and then in the oil business. Of him working in the drug business is having drugstores, which is obviously ludicrous. He doesn't own drugstores or a chain of drugstores. No, he owns the opium trafficking. That's what I'm reading into it. And he's a trafficker. Let's see. If it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay, said Gatsby. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. So again, we have this idea of the abyss and the mist that separates the two of them. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. That's kind of like Gertrude Stein, the expatriate Gertrude Stein, who said a rose is a rose is a rose, right? Now it's reduced from his memory and his nostalgia and his desire, right? April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. So now that he's got what he wants, which is Daisy, now that he's there, he's saying the green light is no more the want and the light of desire. It's the light of a dock. It's just the light of a dock. They fall in love, though. Okay, let's see. Page 96. As I watched him, this is Daisy and Jay Gatsby are now together. As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little visibly. Nick puts them together in his little cottage, which becomes itself a bordello. It's a front, right? His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most, with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. He's a third wheel, but he's almost ghost-like, just like how we had the Valley of Ashes. I looked once more at them, and they looked back at me, remotely possessed by intense life, just like the group. See, they're united in the green light, right? They are now united. The two sides have merged, right? The unification of opposites. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them together. This also reminds me of a scene earlier in the book where Nick is looking at things from a third, as a literal third party. But there's a scene in the book where when they go to that whorehouse in New York, when they make it to the city, he gets drunk and then he looks down from the window and he imagines himself looking back. That's one of the things that the movie did get right. He's looking back up and it's like he can see himself from a third perspective down on the street looking through windows. Now, obviously we know the symbolism of the windows and the mirrors. It's like his mind is splitting. It's like it's been fractured. And here again, we have the reaching out, like Gatsby was reaching out to her, to Daisy across the abyss. And we have the remoteness, right? Remote viewing. We have the remoteness of possession. So it seems like it's both Gatsby possessing something that he wanted. It's Tom who wants to possess Daisy like an object, but it's actually Gatsby who wants to possess Daisy, body and soul. And we have the idea of possession here, like Nick himself has been possessed, and he leaves them together. We always, throughout the book, we get this, another theme is the imagery of windows, always looking into the interior world, and one that the character who's looking isn't part of. At the end of the book, the last time that Nick sees Tom Buchanan, he actually sees him in New York after Gatsby's dead. He sees him in New York, and it says he's looking into a window. I think he's looking into there's something green in the window, but he's looking into a window, and it's like, and his eyes are vacant. It's like he doesn't know who he is, but he's looking into himself, and he's actually looking into the window of a jewelry store. And he says hello to Nick and whatever, and then he goes in and he buys $150,000 pair string of pearls. And then we know that Tom is just going to disappear off into the night, into the world. He's completely insulated. Let's see. We get okay. So yeah, Gatsby's real name is James Gatz, and the truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, says Fitzgerald, means just that. He must be about his father's business, capitalized his father's business. The series of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. This is kind of a demiurge description, right? This is like Lucifer and Jesus at the same time, Charles Manson type of image right here with the Gnostic egg. We get the East egg and West egg. We get the Gnostic Platonic egg. So he invented just the sort of gay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would like to invent. To this conception, he was faithful to the end. Let's see. On page 99, for a while, these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. There was a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing. Oh, here we go. Page 99. Look what it says. He had been coasting along all too hospitable shores for 5 years when he turned up as James Gatz's destiny in, where's the place? The fuck? Right? Sick fucking perverts. Excuse my language, folks. Excuse my language. I'm trying to go over literature here in an adult fashion with no cuss words. I understand that, but it is late. It's 10:37, so we can use some spicy language here, folks, to describe these fucking perverts. Excuse me. He was employed in a vague personal capacity while he remained with Cody. He was in turn okay, so what does he do? You ever seen those pictures of Jepstein Effrey at that party with G-Max and Warvey Heinstein, where they're in he's in an admiral's uniform? Have you ever seen those pictures? And then that reminds me of L. Ron Hubbard and Dianetics and his whole admiral thing, right? And this seems to me to be purposeful on their part for mimicking this, because we get all these naval images, and let's see, because Jay Gatsby was Jay Gatz, and he was like a clam digger, just this pathetic, he was just a dude digging on a beach, and then he saw this yacht that was in trouble out on stormy seas. Right, in the storm of life, he goes out there, he rows up to it, and he helps this dude, and the dude takes him in and teaches him everything. G-Max and the R. Maxwell yacht. Hello, I just thought of that. Right? Remember how R. Max was killed? Remember they boarded his yacht. The yacht was called the G-Max. Hello, remember? And he was drowned. They never found him. Let's see. On page 105, again, we get the idea of oblivion. Tom says, I'd rather not be a polo player. I'd rather look at all these famous people in oblivion. Tom literally says that, oblivion. They just want oblivion. That's why he's always slumming it. That's why he just wants to feel something, right? He goes to the Valley of Ashes, to the wasteland, so he can cheat on his wife with this other woman that he's cucking that guy while he's also being cucked, but he just wants to feel something because he is living in oblivion. They have no morals, no values, the lost generation. Let's see. Daisy, was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place on page 107 that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village. In other words, that Broadway had begotten upon a fishing village. In other words, it's all a front. It's all fake. It's illusion. It's Hollywood. Appalled by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing, it says. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. Tom decides to look into, on page 808, what Gatsby has been doing. He says, I'd like to know who he is and what he does, and I think I'll make a point of finding out. They say he owns some drugstores, a lot of drugstores, LOL. Page 109, there's a swimming party. The idea of swimming in the water is obviously, we talked about the abyss, the chasmic abyss, right, between the East Egg and West Egg. And it also represents it's also foreshadowing the end of the book. Let's see. Okay, here we go. This is a key to the book on page 109 and 110. Here we go. Desolation again. I can't tell you that I circled every time that the word desolate is used in this book. Except for that one. I forgot that one. So page 109, it says, he broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, he ventured. You can't repeat the past, says Nick. Gatsby says, can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly as if the past were lurking here in the shadows of his house, just out of reach of his hand. Well, the shadows of his house. What else is lurking in the shadows of his house, right? The mafia, FBI, three-letter organization, Operation Midnight Climax, blackmail, camera on the other side of the mirror operation. The shadows in terms of the sort of demonic energy that inhabits all these people in this wasteland nothingness of desolation. The shadows of his fractured memory, the shadows of the war, the shadows of his past. He looked a lot about the past. He talked a lot about the past. And I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. Eternal return, ordo ab Caio. Here we go. Here's the this. I'm just going to read to the end of this chapter because it is actually the most beautiful chapter in the book. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. Moonlight again. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in it, which comes at the two changes of the year. The quiet lights in the house were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it if he climbed alone. And once there, he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder, right? The firmament, the ladder, the stairway to heaven, Jacob's ladder. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her, and his lips touch. She blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Through all he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air, but they made no sound. And what I had almost remembered was incommunicable forever. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful passage. It's euphonous, right? It's languid, it's lyrical, but it's also wicked, right? This is Gnostic leveling up. This is transcendence into the Platonic past, right? This is like the dream world of sort of some misty nothingness, because he's trying to get meaning through this unification, right? It was in the next chapter, chapter 7. It says, it was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in his house failed to go on one Saturday night. And as obscurely as it had begun, his career as Trimalchio was over. Trimalchio is a character in the Satyricon. And actually, F. Scott Fitzgerald was going to actually name the book Trimalchio, which I think is actually a better title than The Great. I think The Great Gatsby it's obviously supposed to be ironic, right? And it's ironic and truthful at the same time. But I think it's a lame title, even though it's not lame in the minds of the public and of the culture. And it's one of those titles that it's a big title. It's literally big, The Great Gatsby, and it brings people into it. But I think it's lame because I don't know. It's too maybe that's why it works, because it's too obvious. Just like Gatsby is too obvious, right? He's too obvious to be real or genuine. Yes, he's a front. He's a fake. He's a fraud. And Trimalchio reminds me of Malvolio. But it's obviously, Trimalchio is like, also reminds you of a jester character, right? Let's see. It says, the next part of the chapter talks about people being compromised. I wouldn't want somebody, a newspaper man shows up and they baffled, buggered. Yep. What are you guys doing? Okay, I'm not going to pay attention to the chat. Shout out to everybody who's here with me. Shout out to all my friends out there. And before I forget right now, why don't I give a special shout out to everybody who supported me recently? I really, and ever supported me, but I really appreciate your support. Shout out to Based Homeschool Mom, Rachel. Thank you for supporting me financially. I really appreciate it. Shout out to my homeboy, Jeffsky. Jeff, I love you. Thank you for supporting me. Shout out to beautiful Eleana. You guys, you know her name is pronounced Eleana. That sounds Italian, right? But she's not Italian. But beautiful Eleana has supported me, and I thank you so much. Shout out to Stephen Mulroney, Thomas Henderson, Gabriella. Shout out to Nick, TGF, who supported me. Shout out to, David Atkinson, I think, supported me. Shout out to Mixkey, and shout out to Jerry. Thank you, all you guys who financially supported me. I'm just doing that off the top of my head. And if I forgot you, please, Kristen, thank you so much for supporting me. I really appreciate you. And you guys, yes, thank you so much. And if you want to be like one of those based alpha Chad nerd, based analyzer, breathalyzer people, based analyzers, please look at the links in the chat that my homeboys and my homegirls have dropped and throughout the chat, or in the video description. And please think about supporting me. And if you support me, I know we don't have Streamlabs yet, but if you support me, you can drop a message and I'll read it out loud for you or answer questions. Also, email me at madmaximalism. Mad Maximalism. Let's see. Yes, that's my email for the channel, you guys. Mad Max, MAXX, Maximalism, all one word, at gmail.com. And if you have any questions, I will try to answer them. So I really appreciate that. Let's see. Let's go. I said we were going to finish soon, but I'm still rolling here. There's just oh, here we go. Um, did I get to the part with there's a part with a weird Eyes Wide Shut part. With do you remember that part in Eyes Wide Shut where Tom Coombe is introduced to the Windsor twins? They introduce themselves as the Windsor twins. Nuala Windsor, one of them says. There's a part that is that in this book. It's exactly the same. Okay, let's see. Page 116. Gatsby stood at the center of the crimson carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed, her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. That's interesting. What's the powder? Yeah, I'm sure it's powder, right? Or powder room or whatever. But what else? What other kind of powder could this be? As he left the room, let's see. Oh, here we go. A little girl came into the room. Blessed precious. Come to your own mother that loves you. The child, relinquished by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. Afterward, he kept looking at the child with surprise. Do you think they're pretty? Where's daddy? This child just wanders in, right? Next page, page 118. These fucking people. I'm sorry, but you know, I can't say it here, but we all know what I'm thinking, right? Page 118. Here's where Tom is all of a sudden a Hyperborean. He says, I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year. It seemed that pretty soon the Earth's going to fall into the sun, or wait a minute, it's just the opposite. The sun's getting colder every year. Sounds like he's reading about ice walls and Hyperborea, right? A shout out to ADH. She just mentioned that to me recently, something about Hyperborea. I've heard of making a garage out of a stable, Tom was saying to Gatsby, but I'm the first who ever made a stable out of a garage. Well, he's got a literal stable because he's got polo ponies, but we can't help but think of the stable, right? And the garage with Wilson earlier in the book, remember? Because it's like they say it's a front, like a whorehouse, like a stable. Also, everybody in this book is unstable, except for it seems Tom. Tom's unstable in terms of his. Oh, I skipped over the part. I forgot to mention the part where when they were having that party at the place in New York, Tom all of a sudden slaps Myrtle. She says something that pisses him off, and then he slaps her and breaks her nose, and there's blood everywhere in the apartment. So he is unstable. Let's see. You resemble the advertisement of the man. You know the advertisement of the man. In other words, he's saying he's a fake. Here we go on page 121. The immediate contingency overtook him, pulled him back from the edge of the theoretical abyss. I've made a small investigation of this fellow. I could have gone deeper into the abyss if I'd known. Do you mean you've been to a medium? Inquired Jordan humorously. To a medium? Well, we have the abyss. We had the mention of the occult earlier. This is the funny part. I like this insult. An Oxford man, he was incredulous. Like hell he is. He wears a pink suit. That reminds me of, that plays into the nouveau-riche versus old money thing, because Tom is never going to wear a pink suit. This guy's like, you know, classic establishment. He's wearing, he has fancy suits and tailors and all that stuff, but he's a preppy. He gets, you know, he probably gets his suits made at Brooks Brothers and you know, in America back then would be super fancy. I love Brooks Brothers. But you know, the epitome of preppy, or if he was in London, you know, he would go to Savile Row. Nevertheless, he's an Oxford man, Oxford, New Mexico. We talked about Zorro Ranch. Here we go. I just got wised up to something funny the last 2 days, remarked Wilson. That's why I want to get away, why I've been bothering you about the car. He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically sick. I stared at him and then at Tom, who made a parallel discovery less than an hour before, and it occurred to me there was no difference between men in intelligence or race so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. And then they go on to talk about the giant eyes of T.J. Eckleburg watching them because they're realizing that they are fronts, illusion versus reality, right? I like pink shirts too, Stephen. I only have like 3 pink shirts. 2 are literally pink shirts. The other is from Brooks Brothers. Yes, I like Brooks Brothers, and I actually do like pink. I don't have a pink suit. I'm sure you don't either. But I do like the color pink. Sure, that's cool. They go to the Plaza Hotel. Anybody here ever been to the Plaza? He went to. Here's my little story. School. I think I've told this sort of before. He was in a Christmas Carol, the TV version of a Christmas Carol starring Kelsey Grammer, um, Jason Alexander, and what's her name? What's the hot actress from Party of Five? Not Party of Five. Is it Party of Five? What's the girl's name? Oh, now I can't remember her name. But anyway, they had a thing together. Not in the movie, out of the movie. And anyway, so he came to stay with me in New York. This is right out of drama school. I was living in New York. He came to stay with me in New York, and we went to the premiere of the movie at the Plaza Hotel. And I walked up to Kelsey Grammer, and Kelsey Grammer knew he knew my name. And then we went to this club, Crowbar, like a techno club, and we it was around Thanksgiving. But anyway, that's my little story for the night. It was cool. It was cool. It wasn't an Eyes Wide Shut event. It was like a normal party, but they happened to all be celebs, but it was fun. Needless to say, I'm not bragging, folks, but Kelsey Grammer knew my name. Did you know that listen, I'm not bragging, folks, but you know that song, There Goes My Hero? Well, Dave Grohl admitted to me that he wrote that song about me. I just happen to know that. I'm not bragging. Shouts out to AJ. Okay, so let's see. Tom discovers that he is in with mafia people and with unsavory people on page 34. What about it? Said Gatsby politely. I guess your friend Walter Chase wasn't too proud to come in on it. Oh, snaps, name dropping. As you left him in the lurch, didn't you? You let him go to jail for a month over in New Jersey. God, you ought to hear Walter on the subject of you. He came to us dead broke. He was very glad to pick up some money, old sport, says Gatsby. In other words, he's financing Chase Bank. That sort of ties into Jay. Shout out to Jay's analysis, because Jay talks about, remember that Godfather 3 aspect of Licio Gelli and the Vatican Bank scandal, and how Godfather 3 is about that, how the mafia financed the Vatican. But he financed Chase Bank. You've got something, but you've got something on now that Walter. Oh, here we go. Here we go with the blackmail. That drugstore business was just small change, continued Tom slowly. Drugstore business, meaning drug trafficking. But you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. Right? Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore, Daisy says. And then they talk about how Gatsby had killed a man. I was 30 before me stretched the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments fade with the city lights behind us. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. Okay, so then what happens in the rest of the book is they get to the Valley of Ashes, and what's his name? Wilson has Myrtle locked up in his house. She gets out. She sees the car coming towards them. She thinks that Tom is driving the car, but it's actually Gatsby and Daisy. They run over Myrtle and they keep going. And the book makes it seem like Daisy is the one who's driving, and that Gatsby, says, I'll take the fall. Gatsby's not taking the fall. And I would actually assume that because we hear this not from Nick's own point of view, that they're lying, and that Gatsby was actually driving the car, and that he killed Myrtle, maybe on purpose, because that was Tom's mistress, right? Her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road and mingled her thick, dark blood with the dust in the wasteland. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners. That's a Black Dahlia-esque image, isn't it? Let's see. So then let's see. Page 142. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped from between two bushes into the path. But he stepped from between two bushes, like he's stepping out from between Jacob and Boaz. Actually, in the book, there is one part. I think I can't remember where it is, but he calls Nick Shakespeare, and Nick calls him Boaz, which would be a bonesman name, a bonesman's name. Remember how who was it? Henry, I think it was Henry Luce who was Ball, and then was it George Bush who was Magog? You know, they all have these fucking depraved names in as bonesmen. Because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of the pink suit under the moon. He's shining, right? He steps out from between Jacob and Boaz, and he's shining in his pink suit like the evening star. Nick says, I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. Nick doesn't like him. And then finally, I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. Desolation again, right? Then what we get is the night passes with Gatsby sort of watching out over Daisy in his house with the lights out, but he sees her up in the illuminated for briefly a second, like a tuning fork struck upon a star, right? Sees her up there on the battlements, almost like a Lady Macbeth figure standing on the battlements of the castle. Let's see, on page 148, it was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. He told it to me because Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long secret extravaganza was played out. So what we got in that scene with Tom and Gatsby fighting over Daisy and calling each other out, obviously Daisy's name represents, again, this flower, youth, right? The bloom, the blossom, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying, right? And we get that they're name dropping, and they're doing a big no-no. They're doxing each other and name dropping the information that they're not supposed to reveal, especially in terms of Walter Chase, and somebody has got to die in terms of their paradigm. Here we get Jay Gatsby, and he is broken up and shattered. His personality has been shattered, coming up against the Alpha Tom. Let's see. He made the most of time, his phantom millions, and Daisy is almost like a grail, it says on page 149. Daisy gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. On page 151, it's described as a twilight universe. And then eventually what happens is, let's see, they're a rotten crowd. He said, this is the last thing Nick says to, shout out to all two or three of you in the chat. And shout out to anybody watching this later. They're a rotten crowd, Nick says to Gatsby, you're worth the whole damn bunch put together. Now, everybody sees that and goes, oh, that's the great quote of their friendship. Well, in actuality, it's the opposite of that, right? Because he says the lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption. He had stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream as he waved them goodbye. You okay, baby? Dog's breathing real hard down there. And when he says you're worth the whole damn bunch, what he means is none of them are worth anything, and they're all damned. These people ain't shit, right? Later on, we get what happens is Wilson is sure that Gatsby is the guy who killed his wife, and he may be right. He shows up armed. He makes his way over to East Egg, and he assassinates Gatsby standing by the pool, and Gatsby falls into the abyss, into the pool, right? He falls into oblivion. And then Wilson commits suicide. And then the phrase at the end of that chapter, page 162, it says, after we started with Gatsby toward the house, the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Hala Caust was complete. Interesting, right? Book written in 1925 talking about the Hala Caust. Now, it's obviously not talking about the later one. However, On page, let's see, on page 170, the door that pushed open on the advice of an elevator door was marked the SWASTIKA Holding Company. That's the name of Gatsby's holding company. Can you see that? Right? So maybe he is tied in with the Germans. And by the way, that was a thing in 1925. Remember that Hitler took power ultimately, finally in 1933, but in 1925 they'd had the Munich Beer Hall Push, right? And it's called, and maybe this to me reminds me of like Prescott Bush, and it also reminds me of what's George Bush's what was the name of his oil company? Zorro, was it Zorro? What was the name of his holding company and his oil company? Was it Zorro, you guys? I think it was Zorro, but it reminds me of that, right? And we sort of get this vindication of maybe all the rumors about Gatsby are true. Eventually, Nick goes west. That's my Middle West. That's my Middle West. I'm sorry. But the thrilling returning trains of my youth and the street lamps and the sleigh bells in the frosty dark and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. That's his Middle West. It reminds him of El Greco. And after Gatsby's death from the East, the East was haunted for me like that. He says, we talked about him meeting Tom again. He says on page second, this is a penultimate page here. He says, I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw that what he had done was to him entirely justified. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they'd made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. And then here we go. Last page of the book. He sees a cuss word on the marble clearly in the moonlight. He scratches it out and he says, I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. That is The Great Gatsby. So I think we did a pretty good application of that. Hopefully my thesis statement has been explored and vindicated in this, that Gatsby is he's a sort of an archetype for a Jepstein Effrey. He has all the hallmarks. We got intelligence ties, mafia, criminality. We got illusion versus reality, nouveau-riche versus old money. We got sort of the Valley of Ashes, no man's land, desolation of modernity. We got the fact that there's no salvation in this book and everyone in it is pretty much scum. There's no meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that that Fitzgerald writing it doesn't have meaning. What he's showing is the meaninglessness of modernity, but I think that he probably is the same. And I think that about covers it, you guys. Let's see if we got any final comments, or if anybody happened to drop any fat chats or anything. Thank you guys for being with me here. This was a pretty good one, a pretty long one. We've gone over 2 hours, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you if you're watching this later. Again, if you chat of video. Oh, I can't tell. Again, contact me if you want to through my email. And let's see, I got all these random emails. So yes, contact me again through my email. And thank you to everybody who's been here. Shout out to all my homies. Special shout out to Jerry, right? Congratulations. And we love you. And I'm so glad for your day today. And I pray for you and I appreciate you, homeboy. And it's been a long, hard road for you. And as you said, it's just beginning, but we love you and we're so proud of you, Jerry. I can't express on here how happy I am for you. And we know how it's been. So yes. Also, shout out to Mixky, who will be also getting baptized soon. We love you and we appreciate you. Shout out to ADH for the summer. Shout out to all my friends out there, Ratsky, TGF, Jetsky. I appreciate you again. Thank you everybody for supporting me. And yeah, that's about all I got, you guys. So thank you again. I love you. And thank you so much. Have an awesome, hold on. I'm checking one more thing before we go. Have an awesome Saturday. Or sorry, tonight's Saturday. Now I'm just babbling. What is this? Just got the weirdest email. What the fuck? Oh, okay, whatever. That's lame. Yes. So thank you guys. I really appreciate you and I love you. And I will see you tomorrow. Okay. Peace. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.